everyone. Welcome to episode 65 of the Startup Playbook podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. My guest for today's episode is Jason Lim. Jason is currently the general manager of York Butter Factory, an associate at Melbourne-based venture capital fund Adventure Capital, and a director of the National Innovation Precinct, Hoist. Over the last 5 years, Jason has been at the centre of the Victorian startup ecosystem through his role at the York Butter Factory, helping to drive the local community and fostering connections and collaborations between startups and corporates. He is also the director of Hoist, a new innovation precinct at the Australian Technology Park in Sydney, which is a partnership between YBF and Mirvac. The partnership will bring together various communities, corporate partners, incubators, and accelerators at the Locomotive Workshop in the ATP, providing a collaborative workspace. In this interview, we cover a range of topics, including overcoming a culture of risk aversion, building diversity from the grassroots, playing to your strengths, building effective teams, and the importance of having role models. Without further ado, here is my interview with Jason Lim. Hi, Jason. Welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks for taking the time to be on the show today.
Really great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem at all. I feel like we've known each other for such a long time now.
Heaps of time. Yeah, since a stage label and Startup Weekend and even before that.
I feel like you're like one of the first people that I kind of met before I even moved down here through Startup Weekend and everything as well. So great to get you on the show. But Jason, for those people that maybe aren't as familiar with you or your background, do you want to share a little bit about your story and what got you here today?
Yeah, sure. Condensed version of the story is I grew up in Malaysia. Born and raised there, been here in Melbourne for 7 years now. Grew up with a dad who was a tech entrepreneur back in Malaysia as well. He was one of the first people within the bank to pick up a computer. And at some point realized that, being a head of IT in a bank wasn't going to pay the bills, not in Malaysia anyways. So went out to start his own company doing consultancy, software consulting. So for a long time, he did a lot of the front-end software for the ATMs in Malaysia. And so I got to see firsthand what a tech entrepreneur did, I suppose. And I don't know, a big part of shaping where I am today is being around the dinner table with him and him talking about his experience building a company and how difficult it was, doing a startup kind of thing. So growing up, I guess I always knew that, technology was really interesting. He got me building computers, and I put together a first computer to play games back then. But it was a good introduction to, computers 101. And I knew I wanted to do something in tech. As I grew up, I studied finance and economics and all that kind of stuff, traditional Asian kind of things to study. But I sort of figured, hey, consulting is pretty cool too. Finance is pretty cool too, but I don't really want to work in a Goldman Sachs or a Morgan Stanley or something like that. Didn't really like the kind of culture and environment that perpetuated. So I ended up here at YBF, I suppose. And it's been about 5 years now since I've been with the team. So I get to see a mix of investing in startups, working with the corporates that we have as partners as well. And I guess it's an amalgamation of the technology side of things and also the consulting and finance side of things. So I guess the career path has sort of picked itself out for me.
Yeah, I mean, obviously what you guys are doing at YBF is absolutely incredible, and I want to come back to that a little bit later in the show, but I didn't actually know that about your dad. Oh, yeah. Which is super, super interesting. Was there, obviously in Asian culture, entrepreneurship, like tech entrepreneurship especially, isn't really kind of, I assume back then when your sort of dad left his job and things like that it wasn't really something that would be at the forefront of people's mind. How did that experience kind of shape you, and when did you sort of realize that this was something that you wanted to do yourself? Yeah, no,
you're absolutely right. There was a lot of risk aversion, or there is a lot of risk aversion in Asian culture. In fact, I distinctly remember when the first .com boom happened, and I was still really young at that time. My dad said, don't go into IT because there's a tech apocalypse happening and you'll never ever get a job if you learn how to code. So I kind of took that mentality with me as I was growing up and when I went to university, and that influenced my decision as to what careers to choose and to not choose as well. I sort of see why he said that, but I think it was really encouraging because after I did this, he sort of saw how he influenced my decision to be in the startup world as well. And he saw the similarities in terms of the struggles that I was going through and the company was going through as well. So in that sense, he's been through the journey before. He knows how difficult it is. And I was surprised when I told him that I was going to do all this kind of stuff, because he gave me his blessing from day one. And he said, I completely trust you. Been through the journey before. He would impart advice, and I would often go to him for advice on what to do as well. And I think, a lot of it is also, I think I've had, a crash course MBA on how to manage a team, or how to deal with the founders of YBF, being Darcy and Stu. Often I would apply a filter, which is, how would my dad feel if I acted in a certain way, or if the team acted in a certain way? What would his approach be, and what kind of team member should I be to the people that I lead and the people I follow as well? So, he did have a large effect on my decision and my decision to do this. But he also mentioned, that stability is not necessarily a good thing if you want something for the future. He encouraged me to take a bit of risk as well, because he himself saw that being in a institution like a bank, although he was, head of technology there, it wouldn't necessarily grant you, the future that you want as well. And he took a big risk coming out, and he knew how tough it would be. And I think he saw the same thing for me as well. He knew that this was what I personally was passionate about, and if I wanted to create a future for myself, I had to take a bit of risk, especially since I'm still young.
Sure. It's interesting that you mentioned that that you were a little bit surprised that, not surprised, but like when he gave you his blessing to that you were kind of going into the startup space. Was that, when you say that it was surprising, like was it, I'm assuming that your dad never kind of pushed you into the entrepreneurship space, or never like sort of told you that that's what you should do? Or
no, not at all. Like when I was growing up, he still encouraged me to go down the consulting route or the big institution route, because I think he had provided that stability. He had taken that risk, and I think for a lot of people coming from an Asian background, I think that's a big factor in the decisions that you make in terms of career. A lot of people are, risk averse, for lack of a better term, and they join big companies because there is that stability in it. A lot of our parents growing up had to face that risk, not risk in terms of starting a company, risk in terms of putting food in your mouth, literally, in the face of economic adversity, countrywide, not just company-wide. So they had gone through the struggle. They had seen how difficult it was to make a living for yourself. And I think for a lot of Asian parents, their children going to start another company is taking on even more risk and even more unnecessary suffering that they've been through to try to cover it for yourself. And it was surprising, but I think he trusted in the fact that I knew what I was doing, I suppose. And he trusted the fact that, I was creating a life for myself. So it's a big inhibitor, I think, within the whole Southeast Asian region in terms of that risk aversion. There's so much venture capital money floating around in Singapore and in Malaysia right now, and a big problem is finding the right talent to be able to put that money into, because people prefer to go down the safe corporate route, and that might not be a bad thing as well because of the socioeconomic, position that these people are in as well. But it is a big problem if you're talking about startups, that culture and upbringing.
Absolutely. Like it's funny that you kind of mentioned that. So like I don't have I guess I have kind of a similar story, but different.
Yeah.
Like my dad is very sort of successful in the corporate space. My sister is exactly like him. My mum always, from like the time that I could remember, was like hand making things, and I would go with her to like these like weekend stalls and like try and sell it and those sort of things. And I never really, at that time, like she just loved doing it, and she never kind of saw herself as an entrepreneur or anything.
What happened?
Sorry?
What happened?
What happened? Like, as in she just loved it. So it was just kind of more of a hobby. So she would just like kind of spend her off time during the week kind of doing it, and then on weekends she would just spend the day at these kind of like stalls and stuff, and I would just like help her try and sell it to a bunch of people. But like now she's got a cafe and a restaurant in Canberra and everything as well. So it's been really interesting to kind of see that transition. But like even for my parents, like when I first told them that I wanted to leave my engineering job and jump into the startup space and launch this crazy crowdfunding for fashion platform, they were like, what are you doing? What are
you doing in your life?
Like thankfully, again, like my parents were super supportive, and they were like, okay, we just want you to have a backup option, so you should stay there for at least 2 years. So you have something to fall back on. I lasted 23 months. Yep. But I think like it's really interesting. Like I think that comes from, my parents migrated here when they pretty much had nothing as well. And I think a lot of that comes from, it is really, really difficult. You've had a very fortunate upbringing. You haven't had to go through what we want to go through, and we just want to make sure that you're okay and you're looked after, versus don't pursue your passion. It's more a case of like, we just want the best for you.
Yeah.
And sometimes from their perspective, the safer option is sometimes better.
Yeah.
Sometimes better.
Absolutely.
So obviously, like, we kind of touched on you sort of coming to Australia and being part of the. How long have you been with YBF now?
5 years.
Wow,
About 5 years, yeah.
So almost from were you one of the first hire or one of the first?
No, I wasn't the first hire. I think there were a few hires before me, but I've certainly been the longest tenured hire, and I've been the longest serving employee here since when was it? 2012, September of 2012.
Yeah. So obviously, like, I mean, we've had Darcy and Stu on the show as well.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely incredible. As I mentioned, when I first came down to visit Melbourne for that startup weekend competition, I literally thought all of Melbourne's ecosystem was YBF.
Yeah.
Everything just seemed to come out of here. But it's been really fascinating to watch, how everything's just evolved from YBF over the last, I think, seven years or so.
Yeah, that's right.
From your perspective on being on the inside, how are you seeing things changing and shaping and evolving at YBF as well as kind of the broader ecosystem?
That's a good question. Lots of things to unpack in there. Where to start? I'll start with the easy one first, I guess. Venture capital. I remember distinctly back in 2012-ish, there weren't many venture funds at all. In fact, we were probably running one of the only few venture funds out there. We weren't huge by any means, but again, we were one of the few. I just recently went on a trip to New Zealand with a bunch of other VCs, and there was about $2 billion worth of venture capital money who attended the trip. So
flying from Australia to New Zealand.
From Australia to New Zealand. So you had SquarePeg. Blackbird didn't go, but Blackbird's probably one of the other big funds. Airtree was there, Ballador, a bunch of Alien Capital, a lot of new investors coming into the venture capital space, which is really encouraging because you need venture capital money to grow. And it's at the forefront of people's minds right now, this whole entrepreneurship tech movement. It's really great. In terms of companies that we're seeing, that's a good question. I think, the quality of companies has increased over time. There was a period of time where everyone tried to do the Airbnb for Y and Uber for X's, but I think that's changed. I think people are starting to see what what Australian strengths are and building on those strengths to create good companies. Companies from New Zealand as well have been fairly impressive as of late, and there's, I guess, a testament to the quality of companies has been the amount of overseas money that has come into Australia as well. Just the other day, Hyperana from one of Airtree's investments had a huge funding round from Sequoia as well.
Sequoia,
yeah, 90 Seconds as well, and a couple of others as well. So I think, if anything, the quality's improved for companies. I think it's a bit more competitive now to get good talent for these companies. You're seeing, Slack coming into Melbourne, GoPro, all these other big tech companies coming in, and I think a question in everyone's heads is, and certainly I've had a few conversations with entrepreneurs as well, is how do we afford to hire these people, these really high talented people, when all these large tech companies are coming into the scene? But I think it's a self-selecting thing. Yeah, if you find good talent who have that risk aversion. That risk-loving kind of mentality and the resilience, then regardless of the pay or whatever it is, they're still going to end up in startups anyways. So it is quite a bit of a self-selecting thing. I think it's great that the government's trying to get involved in startups as well. They're trying to put money into it. I don't know. It's come a long way since back then. It's at the forefront of everyone's minds right now. Yeah,
I mean, absolutely. I've only really been in Melbourne for about 3.5 years now, and just kind of seeing how things have evolved just within that shorter space of time has been fascinating. Fascinating to see. But so actually, interesting point that you mentioned about sort of the larger US-based companies that are sort of starting to expand and set up in Sydney and Melbourne. It's interesting in terms of the whole sort of talent equation, because I think that's, from speaking to a lot of companies that are at that scale stage, one of the most challenging parts for them is how do you find the right sort of people and how do you sort of attract them. And I think like having those companies here is potentially a good thing as well, in the sense of you're taking a lot of people who potentially haven't seen what it's like inside a huge company of that size and scale and having to move really, really quickly, and then taking those lessons out and then sort of applying them to either local companies or spinning off their own things as well. It's I think that kind of self-selection point is actually a really interesting part of that as well, is now that there's more opportunities and more options there, that kind of potentially helps speeds up that process.
100%. Like, one of the things that I keep telling people is the reason why a place like San Francisco works really well is because you try as tech startup, you fail, what's the worst thing that could happen? Like, you get hired by Netflix or Google or Facebook. And that's happening here as well. Like, we've had a few entrepreneurs who have tried and maybe had a bit of bad luck, and they've ended up in companies like IBM, and that's a really great thing. They get to experience that whole large tech company lifestyle, and they get to build up their savings again, and maybe one day take the leap again to create companies. I guess the other question is, that will talent keep up with the flow of people going into these larger companies? Hopefully. That's a lot of work to be done on a grassroots level as well, to educate people to build startups. And I think a big part that's been missing as of late has also been a diversity piece, around trying to get women into startups in tech as well. I think it's great that there's been a focus on that diversity aspect as of late as well, because if 50% of the population don't know that this is a career option for them, then it's a big wasted opportunity. And certainly we should be investing in helping people to access, tech and startups, regardless of the background or age or sex or ethnicity. So as long as we keep the grassroots stuff going, and even, from people at a younger age as well, how do we teach people in, primary school or kindergarten, how do we get that entrepreneurial flair going? That's a big problem in Asia where I come from. You go into the education system and it spits out people who are really, they have that closed mind thinking. They're not creative. They do things to check boxes, and that's the opposite of what a startup needs. So if we can keep evolving the education system as well and creating opportunities for younger people as they mature and grow through the education system, then I think, more talent's going to grow into startups. And regardless of where our current talent is going, we'll always have that supply of people who are starting and trying new companies and who are creating new and exciting things.
Absolutely. I feel like my own personal thinking has evolved over time with this, but what do you like? Do you think that everyone can and should be a founder?
No, I don't think so. Because if everyone's a founder, then who's going to actually help build the companies for the founders to realize their dreams? No, I don't think everyone should be a founder. I think the whole founder thing has been a bit, it's been dramatized a bit, I guess. There's a bit too much celebrity and hero worship into the founder journey. Some people are going to be creative. Some people are going to be really excellent at starting companies and coming up with new ideas. Some people are going to be really good at executing those ideas and seeing them grow to the next level. This is probably a bigger question around, the virtues of capitalism versus non-capitalism. But no, I don't think everyone can be a founder, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think people need to realize what their strengths are, what their passions are, and you don't need to fit into a box to say, check, I'm a founder, cool, I've done my time, I've done my dues, I've done the mandatory thing. It's not. Everyone can be whatever they want to be, and I think it's silly to be lumping someone into a box and saying you have to be a founder to be successful. I think that's a bit crazy.
Yeah, I think what you touched on there about kind of doubling down on your strengths, I think one of the things that's kind of changed for me was I actually used to think that everyone could be a founder, right? And just get an idea and kind of launch something. But yeah. I think part of that, and again, you kind of touched on this, is, a few people went through that journey and then just sort of realized, maybe I just need some time, or I need to learn more skills, or maybe even just an early stage startup isn't for me and I need to go join a company like IBM or go join another startup. But I think what you kind of said about, can we glorify other areas of startups, because it isn't just a founder that makes something successful as well. It's all about the team. I
think a great example is probably Sheryl Sandberg. She's never been a founder, and yet I think she's been probably one of the most pivotal people in the entirety of startup world at this point in time. Without her, I don't know if Facebook could become Facebook today. I think the challenge for founders is being able to realize that they do need these people to help grow the companies, and also to economically incentivize these people as well. I think every company has a moral duty to share the rewards with their employees as well, because a company isn't a one-man adventure or one-person adventure. Everyone builds a company, and everyone should reap the rewards for seeing that company, to be incentivized to build it together. And I think it's silly if, I think it's silly that there's such a disparity between what CEOs earn versus what the other part of the workforce earns as well. That needs to change. It'll probably take a long time, but I think, companies like Envato, for example. Envato recently announced a profit share scheme with their employees, and I think that's a great step forward to signal to the market that, hey, it's not just the founders building the company, it's everyone. This company belongs to everyone. So I think if we could uncover more Sheryl Sandbergs of the world and to help them reach their potential instead of saying, you should be a founder, I think that's a great thing. If Sheryl went on to start a company, it could have been really big. Maybe it couldn't have been big. I don't know. That's a different alternate reality. But what we do know is that she was incredibly successful in turning Facebook into the company that it was today. And if everyone had tried lumping her into that founder kind of role, maybe Facebook wouldn't have been the behemoth that it is today.
Absolutely. I think one of the things, again, like I just want to dive in a little bit deeper, is the incentivizing people around you. One of the things that I see with a lot of early stage startups is, or when I have meetings with early stage startup founders is, I can't get my team to kind of commit, or we've just had a co-founder leave, or all of those things. And I think there's an expectation from people that, why doesn't someone else believe in this as much as I do?
Yeah.
Again, you would have dealt with a lot of early stage startups, both from an Adventure Capital and a YBF perspective. What are your kind of thoughts on that?
That's an interesting question. The challenge for founders is that they're so busy sometimes that they don't see I think founders are good at coming up with ideas, and I think that's their role. Their role is to come up with ideas and to see the chessboard in the future, not maybe the chessboard that is currently in front of them, and that they need someone to look after that. Different companies go about this in different ways. Like Facebook obviously hired a COO to run today's chessboard. Other companies like Twitter hired, a CEO. They brought in this external CEO to be that person. There's a lot of, I think, unconscious bias that needs to be overcome if people want to really incentivize employees. And Charlie Munger talks a lot about the psychology of mismanagement or something like that as well. Being, what are the unconscious psychological things that as leaders and founders you're not seeing in terms of incentivizing people, or in terms of creating a structure that incentivizes people for the long term. When we're so busy building companies, we think about what our customers want. We think about what kind of product we want to build. We don't necessarily think a lot about what kind of culture that we want and what kind of people we want to keep. And I think a big example of that recently has been Uber as well. $60+ billion company with a culture that's just imploded internally. And sure, you've got the gains in terms of dollar figure, but is that really a legacy that you want to leave behind? I don't know. People talk about startups being, hey, I built a startup because I want to change the world for the better. But if you can't even look after your team, like your own people, are you really changing the world for the better? I don't know. In 100 years, maybe that will be different. I don't have the right answer. I think as a team, we are still working out the best way to motivate our employees as well, and to get everyone onto that long-term journey. But what I do know is that everyone contributes an equal amount of value, and that everyone should be rewarded when the time comes for it. Absolutely.
Like I think the rewards that founders are often able to give at that very early stages isn't sufficient for what people are actually putting in. And I think one of the things that often gets overlooked, like I've made so many mistakes when it comes to managing people, but I think like one of the things that often gets overlooked is, as you mentioned, there's a huge amount of focus on, fundraising or getting the product out or servicing customers. As much, if not more, time should be spent on, what do the people around you, what are they actually looking for? Like, what are they in this for? How do they sort of grow, or how do you sort of create a structure that allows them to go on and be successful and like go on and do their best work? And I don't think enough people focus on that as much as possible, especially obviously at the very early stages it's hard to do that, but even when you're giving out sort of putting in structures and things like that, I think it's really important to kind of think about, as you said, the long term.
Definitely. And sometimes it's not out of malice as well. Sometimes founders genuinely care about the team and they want to give free rein to the team to grow, especially when it's still small. You want your team to grow really quickly, so you give them all that freedom to do whatever they want and to run with things. But again, it's about recognizing strengths and weaknesses. Founders are really good at that broad, open spectrum. Like they can filter ideas really quickly and focus and get things done. Some people don't work that way. Some people need some form of structure to be able to grow and to excel. So I think sometimes it's also that misalignment of expectations between what the team needs and what the founder needs. So it's all about knowing the individual, and that might be tough to scale in a larger organization. But when it's still a small team, like I think founders should pay attention to the team and to see what kind of structure or non-structure they need, depending on the person, to help them succeed. Because you wouldn't hire someone unless you thought they had immense potential.
Do you have any recommendations on how you can find out what your strengths and weaknesses are? Because I feel like that's potentially an area where people really tend to struggle, is like, it's hard being self-aware enough to know what you're good at and what you sort of need help with.
That is a very good question. I don't have the right answer to that, but what we've done lately is we've brought in someone named Nardia Rennie. She's great. She's our culture coach. She helps us individually as well as a team. And I think she spends a lot of time sitting, and certainly with me, she spent a lot of time sitting down with me and said, like, I want you to write down all your strengths and weaknesses, because I know you spend a lot of time thinking about your weaknesses and about how you can improve, but you also need to be aware of your strengths and you need to be aware of what you can contribute. So it was literally just, me sitting down with her and said, look, I think you have strengths in this areas. I think you have weaknesses in this areas. Do you agree or do you disagree? And it was just me chiming in to say, all right, I agree. I think I am good in this area, and I think I should be growing myself in this area. So having someone to bounce off that feedback, that objective feedback, is really handy. Someone you can trust, someone who is themselves introspective enough to know what their own strengths and weaknesses are. I think looking for people, role models as well in society, who you can model yourself after, is also a really good thing. One of my personal heroes is a person named George Catlett Marshall, who was the U.S. He was the chief of staff during World War II, and everyone remembers the Dwight Eisenhowers and the George Pattons and all that kind of stuff. But they all reported to George Catlett Marshall, and nobody knows him because he was humble and he never took credit for anything that he did. But I picked up a biography, I read about him, was so enthralled by this character that we never hear about, that I decided, hey, this is a good way to live. This is the kind of person who, he wins wars, so surely applying those virtues to a company will work too.
Yeah, so like I've never had an external coach or anything. I think that one of the things that kind of helped me figure things out was just having a really big low.
Right.
And getting down to it, and then just kind of like realizing, there's a couple of things that I'm really, really good at, and there are a few things that I'm really, really shit at.
Right.
And also, like, you kind of spoke about culture as well. I think one of the big kind of aspects of that is just letting people feel comfortable enough to be open and give feedback, both positive and negative.
Yeah. Around
particular things. I think that's really, really important. Like, it's hard, again, going back to kind of the incentives, it's hard to know what people want or what they want to achieve unless if you actually open up that conversation and ask them.
Yeah, and there are some really weird frameworks that you can apply as well. There's something called the 5 love languages out there. People usually use it for...
I did that test recently.
Yeah. Apparently you can apply it like within your team as well to see what kind of affirmation works well for certain team members. Some people like gifts, some people like, time spent with them, some people like verbal affirmation. So I think that kind of stuff is really handy as well to see what kind of positive feedback works for certain people.
Absolutely. So I want to come back. Like, I feel like we went on a massive tangent.
Yeah,
but I want to come back to YBF. And so you mentioned like one of the things that you especially sort of starting off with YBF was looking at the venture arm. Obviously, funding, as you mentioned, is a really big kind of focus area for a lot of startups, rightly or wrongly, at different stages. From a adventure capital sort of perspective, what were some of your learnings, and what was kind of some of the commonalities between startups that you were really interested in and startups that you decided not to proceed with?
I think the biggest learning was probably team. Finding the right team, making sure the founders are harmonious and work together, both in the bad and good times, because sometimes even the good times can exacerbate founder issues in terms of, hey, I've got more of the pie or less of the pie or whatever it is. Start a boot camp. One of the accelerators that has just come to Victoria, their co-founder came down to meet us the other day, and he says that for every company that goes through Startup Bootcamp, he puts them through a pre-mediation session. So before any problems crop up, before they even have a single session with a Startup Bootcamp team, they see a psychologist to work out future and current issues.
Wow.
And I think that's really cool because they have some really great statistics. Apparently like 74% of their startups get funding and 80+% survive after year 5 or some ridiculously high number like that. So it seems to work. And yeah, from our experience, filtering the right team members has been the hardest part because people show you different sides of themselves depending on what outcome they want to get. So finding ways to filter that out has been a tough exercise, and some problems and some traits materialize after years. So yeah, the biggest learning for us is how do we find the right founders to back them and get them to the next level.
Sure. So I feel like this gets kind of thrown around a lot in terms of like, we're looking for the right team or the perfect team. What does a perfect team look like to you?
Oh, that's a good question. What does a perfect team look like to me? Well, I know that it's usually better to have more than one founder. Usually one founder has to be extremely forward-looking. And if you have that extremely forward-looking founder, you also need a founder who's grounded in reality and who can actually execute. So you can't have just like two founders go off on a tangent and go crazy. Inventors are an interesting one. Putting money into inventors can be a double-edged sword. On one hand, they're extremely brilliant. On the other hand, you have the same problem that every scientist and every research institution has, like CSRO, which is, hey, I'm a scientist or I'm a researcher. I've just built this cool thing. I've made a new discovery. Awesome. Let's go look for new discoveries again instead of commercializing what I've just built. So in terms of putting money into really great inventors, I think, yeah, maybe find a operator to go alongside them as well. Other learnings of what makes a good team. Virtues, I think, are important. Finding out what their personal beliefs are, what the personal code of conduct is, I suppose, because I'd like to think we don't just back founders who can do good companies or can build good companies. I like to think we back founders who are good people inherently as well. And that means finding out what their beliefs are, what they will and won't do in certain situations. And that has been the toughest part to vet, I think. You need to spend a lot of time with people to be able to know that.
So for companies that kind of made it through that vetting process for you guys, what were, again, through both YBF and through Adventure Capital, I'm sure you've had sort of access and seen so many different companies go through. What were some of the things that the companies that went on to be successful, what did they get right at the early stages?
What did they get right? I don't know what they got right, but I know in terms of a trait, they were all resilient as heck. One of the last company we funded was Pantry, and that came out of a startup weekend event, like the one that you went through as well when you were launching Stage Label. But Lee and Josh met at a startup weekend event for the first time. They won the startup weekend and then decided to build a company. And I think it was about a whole year that they pitched us the idea for Pantry, and they built 7 different product iterations before we put any money into the company. So as soon as we put the money in, like, we had a year of seeing how they worked. They worked out of YBF during that entire period, and we went, right, regardless of what happens to this company, they're going to be extremely resilient. So like, let's try backing this. So I think all the companies that we've backed so far have been extremely resilient founders. They've all gone through bad times, and they've all come out fairly unscratched. So, well, with a few scars, obviously, but they've all found a way to power through. So I think resilience and tolerance to resilience as well. And not just with the founder, but with the team as well. Sometimes people hire team members who fit the particular skill sets that they're looking for, but not necessarily on the culture end as well. And by culture, I don't just mean microculture, which is culture within the team. I'm talking macro culture as well, which is culture within the whole startup environment as a whole. People can gel along with other people from the team, but some people are just not tolerant to change and uncertainty. And as soon as some uncertainty hits, they panic. So either the founder creates some kind of framework to help them get through that tough period, or you find people who are founder-esque in their tolerance to risk and their tolerance to uncertainty as well. So finding the right employees as well is really critical.
It's interesting that you sort of bring up resilience. Like, obviously, I think there's so much focus that goes into, successful exits and large funding rounds and all of that. I think a lot of the things that often get overlooked is like all of the steps and all of the ups and downs that happen before that. So just in the last podcast episode, I interviewed Kate Morris, who, now you look at it 18 years later and, $28 million revenue, like, going really well. But, she spoke about how it took her 10 years to really see any substantial growth in the company.
Wow.
And most people, there's no way that you would last 10 years without kind of seeing a massive kind of like upturn with it. But
crazy. Yeah,
I think the resilience also kind of comes a little bit from being really passionate about the problem or the space that you're sort of operating in. How important has that been in terms of what you've seen come through, or in the specific example of Flea or the guys from Pantry?
Yeah. You got to be passionate if you're going to risk everything on the line to do it. I don't know. Passion is an interesting one because, like, Darcy and I were talking about this the other day as well. Do you really need to be super, super passionate about something to be successful in it? Can passion manifest itself after you've started working on something, or does passion have to be a prerequisite to actually building something? And that's a good question. I don't have the answer to that. You eventually become passionate about it if you spend enough time with it. It's just human, so you latch on to something and you have that loss aversion, so you never want to lose something that you've dedicated time and energy into. But I think we're in the 21st century. I think people should be working towards things that leave the world a better place. And I think that should excite people. Leaving a mark. I think leaving a legacy drives a lot of founders as well. I think a lot of founders who do it for the money end up, I don't know, like it just seems wrong to me. It's bringing the Wall Street kind of culture into startup world, which has been quite pervasive as of late, which is the delayed gratification thing. I think it's completely wrong. Like, people used to talk about, don't go into one of those investment banks because you're going to sell your soul and you're going to work late nights, late hours, and you're only going to see a payoff in 10 years when you become partner. And that kind of sounds familiar if you put that in a context kind of space as well. For startups, you work crazy hours and you work crazy amounts of days and weeks and nights, and you don't see big returns until a couple of years down, like 10 years, for example, in your last interview. So I think if you do it for the money, you might as well just go to an investment bank or somewhere else with a higher probability of success. You have to be passionate about the problem you're solving. You have to really believe that you're leaving the world a better place. Like, what else drives humans to do what they do? It's leaving a legacy behind, I would like to think, and leaving the world a better place.
Yeah, I feel like there's a huge illusion with freedom. Like, I don't know if you've seen all of the Instagram posts. It's like, leave your 9 to 5 and like go pursue what it is that you want to do.
Oh, it's like, yeah.
Yeah, I've got friends who aren't in the startup space and they're like, oh, it's great. Like, I have all these issues with my boss and you have no boss. And it's like, no, you don't understand. Like, everyone that I work for and all my clients and stuff, like, they're all my bosses.
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
So, yeah, it's completely flipped around the other way.
Yeah.
But, yeah, I think when it comes to, like, I think, like, passion's an interesting one. Like, I've had so many different conversations with this. Take the podcast, for example.
Yeah.
I don't actually like the process of editing and doing the podcast, but what I love is like, getting to chat with really interesting people and picking their brains, and like, doing that consistently is what I enjoy doing.
Yeah.
So I think it's almost like you might not enjoy the process, but like the underlying thing that you're doing has to really kind of get you to go through all of the crap and the ups and downs.
What was the reason you started a podcast? Were you really passionate about it at the start of the whole podcast thing?
No. So like even now, I actually don't even. Everyone's like, how many, like, what podcasts do you listen to? I'm like, oh, I'm really bad. Like, I actually don't listen
Not
to
really.
that many.
Yeah.
But I think that the thing for me was, I felt like there was a lot of content out there that was varying degrees of usefulness. I felt like there were a lot of people, especially from an Australian context, there was so many people that had a lot of great insight from things that they'd done previously that weren't that hadn't kind of really shared their story, or that was accessible to a lot of people. And so for me, it was just a case of like, how do you learn from people that have been there and done that, and their specific example might not be relevant to you, but it's another story and that might be relevant to someone else.
Definitely. You saw a problem and you said, hey, I'm going to solve it, and you along the way found the passion for it, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, again, like, I hate taking notes. Like, it was another way of like, I feel like this is the best way for me to learn, of like, again, having these amazing conversations instead of writing notes and then looking at it again. It's something that I can just like listen to in a different way. So it was very much like, it was very much for me, but it was also like I saw the value for other people from that too. Yeah,
and that's actually a really good point as well, because if you read the Everything Store, the book about the start of Amazon and whatnot, like, Jeff Bezos wasn't freaking passionate about books. He wasn't passionate about selling anything over the internet. He just saw that, hey, there's this thing called the internet where I can sell stuff, made a spreadsheet and went, what's the cheapest thing I can ship over mail? Like, if someone orders something, it's books. I'm going to start with books. So he saw a problem, solved it, and I don't know, maybe along the way he got passionate about it. So yeah, maybe that's the answer. Like, you don't have to be super passionate about something at the start, as long as it develops over time, but as long as you're solving a real problem, that's what really matters.
So I guess one of the things that's really impressed me about obviously everything that's kind of coming out of YBF at the moment is a lot of the sort of partnerships and the corporate partnerships that that you've developed, and really connecting the startup ecosystem with the corporate landscape. I wanted to talk a little bit with you about why, I guess not why, but like, what are some of the opportunities for startups and corporates to start working closer together, and how do you sort of see that moving forward?
Interesting question, that one. Okay, so to start with, I think there's this big trend right now, which is corporates love either sponsoring spaces and treating startups like a petting zoo, or corporates love running accelerator programs. People might have different ideas on whether they're successful or the right thing to do, but just to give some context around a corporate partnerships, like we're sitting right now in the Coles meeting room, named after our first ever partner, Coles. And the way that we started working with them was they had a team offsite in this very room, initially with no need for contact to the outside world, wanted to keep everything internal, just needed a space out of their four walls to work from. Along the way, they sort of realized, hey, there's this actually a pretty cool company sitting like right next door that's solving something that we were thinking of building ourselves. And those connections kept happening, and then we thought, hey, that's actually a really good thing, for corporates to be able to have access to what these startups are doing. Corporates have a lot of money and a lot of resources. Startups have great products, and they have the passion and time to solve these issues. Why don't we mix those two together? So over time, I guess what we've done has evolved as well. So it's not just about that. We bring the network, which is giving corporates access to what the companies in the space are doing, and within the larger ecosystem as well. We've been in this for a long time, that we've seen a lot of startups come through who aren't even physically in the space itself. We give them access to culture as well, because for a lot of these corporates, the issue is that you've been so ingrained in your day-to-day kind of stuff that even if you set aside an innovation team, that team will still stick to old ways of doing, work as if you were still in a corporate, like expecting 90-day payment terms when you're working with a startup. Just doesn't work. Or expecting everything to be handed to you on a plate. Like, no, like you have to be a generalist as well. You can't just focus on one function because you are a startup founder now, for lack of a better term. We help also bring some of our experience into building companies to these corporates as well, because they haven't built something from scratch, or as Peter Thiel calls it, 0 to 1. We help bring that expertise. And lastly, we bring a bit of our experience in the corporate venturing space to these corporates. What we've done as of late is we've begun doing a very incubator-ish model as well, where we've started our own companies with help from corporates. So that's all the stuff that we've been bringing in. I think what separates us from a lot of people is that we don't do sponsorships, we do partnerships. We expect things from corporates as well. We don't just want to bow down to their every wish. We expect them to be entrepreneurial. We expect them to put in the time, energy, and resources to actually make this partnership work. We tell them we don't run accelerators. We don't run UX courses or whatever it is. There are some people out there who do it really, really well, but that's not us, because a lot of corporates seem to come to us with that expectation. But what we do well are those 4 things, which is the network, the culture, 0 to 1 building, and also corporate venturing.
Yeah, again, like I think one of the things that really kind of stuck out to me with that was, what do you sort of bring to the table? And I think like a lot of the times when people think about sponsorship or partnerships in general, a lot of it is, we would love to partner with X because, we get Y from that. Yeah. Without really kind of considering what do you actually bring to the table. And so like, how is that? Was that something that was kind of clear to you guys, or it sounded like that kind of came a little bit organically from people that were already sort of around the space? Yeah,
it took a while for that to happen, because we've worked with some corporates that have been difficult in the past, who only wanted to reap a lot of the rewards. In fact, I think for a lot of corporates still, they think that working with startups is doing the startups a favor. So they'll say, we'll give you access to distribution and all that kind of stuff, but we won't pay you. So I think that's a big issue in the fact that I think these corporates are sometimes devaluing the work that these startups are doing. If they want to really work with startups, they have to have skin in the game, and that means monetary backing as well. We do have a scoring matrix for all our corporates as well, so we'll see if they align with our culture, our values, and if they can actually bring positive value to our startups as well. Because if we expect our startups to work with the corporates, they have to know that the corporates are also bringing value to them. So it's only right that we filter them out that way.
Sure. And obviously, speaking of partnerships, there was that recent announcement with Mirvac about partnerships for the Hoist.
Yes,
I think it's called, which you're now leading. I'd love to kind of find out a little bit more about what you're doing at the Hoist.
Yeah, so Hoist is our joint venture with Mirvac to firstly activate the Australian Technology Park in Sydney. So the history of the Australian Technology Park, or the ATP, is long and storied, but to condense it, Atlassian tried to purchase the area at one point in time to turn it into an innovation kind of area. Were ultimately unsuccessful, and Mirvac and a consortium of others had managed to scoop up the ATP. Along the way, it's been the home for a lot of companies in the tech space. Cisco has an office there. Cicada has an office there, doing deep tech and robotics and all that kind of stuff. But the bigger question is, how do we not just attract all these big tech players? How do we also attract startups into the space? And how do we also attract corporates like what we're doing at YBF into an area where they can mingle with all these large and small tech companies? So Hoist is really here to help create innovation precincts. And what we mean by innovation precincts is, the best example is, you have level 39 in London, but level 39 is in Canary Wharf. And the whole Canary Wharf is just an area that's absolutely ripe for fintech. You have banks beside level 39, you have all these fintech companies, not just in the level 39 building, but the whole of Canary Wharf. So imagine multiple Canary Wharf equivalents throughout Australia, starting at the ATP, where we bring all these corporates into the space, bring startups into the space, large tech companies, and then you have that serendipity of activity and people working together. Culture, people think, can be organic. I think sometimes culture needs a little bit of a kick to get happening, which is why we have a team of people who we're going to put in there to be able to help foster the interaction. We've been doing that a lot with the YBF team. So the way we view community management might be different from the way other people view community management. For us, community managers are an extension of the startups that choose to work from YBF. They're the team members that these startups never had, kind of thing. So we want our community managers to be the first people that startups go to when they have a problem. When they have a problem raising funding, when they have a problem getting distribution, when they have a problem in hiring, we want our community managers to be the first point of people who can solve that problem for them. We want them to be routers to say, I know the person who can solve this problem for you. And for the corporates as well, we want corporates to go to our community managers to say, I'm thinking of maybe doing, accepting payments from Chinese customers. Who do I go to that's built a product like this? And we want our CMs to know off the top of the head exactly who to connect to. If we can replicate that on a larger scale in the ATP, with not just with startups and corporates, but also with large technology companies, I think there can be some really great products that come out of this. We don't want to compete with anyone in Sydney for Hoist. We want to work with the community in Sydney. So if co-working spaces want to take up space in the ATP, I think that would be awesome. For Hoist to work with all these co-working spaces would be a great thing, because we want to curate an area, not just a building or a location or a space.
Fantastic. And is the Hoist space live at the moment, or
We've just got our first furniture in. We're about to install our Wi-Fi at the moment. Cisco has very kindly sponsored some access points and potentially Spark boards as well. So shout out to Cisco. So it'll be launched very, very soon, in the next couple of weeks, cool. 1 or 2 weeks actually.
Watch this space.
Watch this space.
And obviously, one of the big announcements was TechCrunch Battlefield coming down as well, which I believe will be held at Hoist.
Correct. Yes. So the ATP is probably one of the very few spaces in Sydney that can host a conference of that caliber. In fact, so the ATP is a whole area, but it's got multiple sheds in it, and we share the same shed as the area that's hosted. The other large conference in Sydney, what was it called again? StartCon. That's right. Oh no, not StartCon. Above All Human. Not Above All Humans,
Victoria.
Blackbird's one. Sunrise.
Sunrise.
Yes,
yeah.
It's hosted Sunrise as well. So it's one of the few places that can actually fit these large kinds of conferences. So obviously really excited. TechCrunch is gonna be massive. We had their COO down here the other day, and it's the kind of event that I think won't compete with all these other great local events, like Sunrise, StartCon, and the others. I think it'll attract a different clientele. It'll attract international startup players and participants as well, not just locals. So I think it's going to offer a different perspective to the startups in Australia.
I want to just wrap up on that sort of final point around competition as well. Like I feel like a lot of the time there is that kind of sense of, for the podcast, for example, there are all these other podcasts launching. I think it's a great thing. Like, I think the more information, the more stories we have, everyone sort of benefits of the back of that. And similarly with, like, sort of as you mentioned, you want to work with some of the other co-working spaces and everything else that's kind of happening. I think that's how we grow the ecosystem. It isn't from competing or trying to fight for land.
Totally.
It's more about how do we sort of work together and make this better for everyone.
Yeah, scrap the tall poppy syndrome.
Absolutely. Jason, on that note, for anyone that wants to find out more about you, say hello, get in touch, and just find out more about Hoist or YBF, Adventure Capital, everything else, what's the best way for them to do that?
I would say social media, but I've recently unplugged myself from all forms of social media. Yeah, I have.
What brought that on?
Just too much noise. I've got rid of Instagram. I don't have Snapchat. I've unfollowed everyone on Facebook. So I'm pretty much social media-less. So don't try contacting me there. No, I just wanted to get a bit more focus in my life, and science has shown that it increases depression, and you get all these mini dopamine hits, and it makes you unproductive as heck. So I thought I'd just get rid of it.
I feel like we're gonna have to get you back on in a few months and just find out how
the experiment goes.
How the experiment's been going.
Going well so far.
So how do people find you?
Send me an email, jason@yorkbutterfactory.com or jason@adventurecapital.vc, or my personal email, jason@jason.vc. Hop onto our website. We've got the YBF website, yorkbutterfactory.com. If you want to learn more about Hoist, go to hoist.com.au. Built that website in 3 days or 2 days.
It looks good.
Thank you.
I had a look at it just the other day.
Appreciate it. I'm glad you said that. It was long nights. But yeah, just reach out if anyone needs anything, and happy to help.
Perfect. Once again, Jason, thanks for coming on and sharing your story.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Cheers. Thanks for listening to episode 65 of the Startup Playbook podcast. You can find the show notes of my interview with Jason, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at episode 66 next week.